Um, Folks, if y'all are feeling warm and fuzzy inside, that leads us to some more new material. I told you this class is the gift that keeps on giving, okay? And listen, it being Thanksgiving week, I know y'all are all thankful for learning all kinds of crazy real estate stuff and diving into financing tonight. Don't act like you're not excited. And so that is where we are. So, financing really kind of has two different pieces to it. And, we'll kind of blur them together. There's a little bit of a break in between the two sections, but one of them is principles, one of them is practice, more than any way that I could describe it better than that. And so, the reason real estate financing is such a big topic of discussion, folks, is because the vast majority of people purchasing real estate are doing some type of financing. Yeah, some people will have cash to buy the house completely. Other people will put down some cash and then borrow the rest. And even if they have cash, some people will sometimes leverage the money. And so we've got a lot of different things to talk about in this section. Now, this is also where some different things are going to come full circle. Like when we talked about liens and lien priority and the difference between title theory states and lien theory states and the deed of trust and things of that nature. We kind of loosely talked about it in earlier units, but here's where you'll get the full story on the differentiation between the mortgage and the deed of trust and kind of how this all goes. And of course, there is some math in this section and, a lot of vocab in this section. I've told y'all multiple times, agency, contracts, financing, and valuations. Hands down the hardest and most testable sections, bar none. Every section's testable, but you get so much more, so many more, whatever the correct articulation there is. So there's a lot more questions from these sections overall. And so it's really stuff that you got to know. Now, I am going to go ahead and say this, folks. We're going to talk about everything that you really need to focus on for the financing section, but much like some of the other topics, it's not really something that you can just hear it once and be good on it. So I would recommend that you do sometime after this week, prior to next week, that you do go back and find the financing video and re-listen to it. If any of you are doing any Thanksgiving prep and cooking, play it in the background while you're making the turkey, okay? Because you've got to hear the financing section over and over. There's just so much to it. And while your brain can associate certain things with familiarity in day-to-day life, other things you've never heard before. It's just the honest to God truth. So now that I've kind of explained that, let me introduce one of the reasons why financing is so tricky, folks. There's a lot of things in the real estate industry and what you know in your personal lives that I've referred to as misnomers. You think it's one thing, but it's really not. And so the prime example is there are so many people who will call their monthly payment their mortgage payment. And I told you in North Carolina, we don't even have mortgages, which is why that's a misnomer. Now, please don't think that if you get a test question that says such and such is making a mortgage payment, just interpret it as the generic monthly payment. They're not trying to trick you there, but it's not really a mortgage payment. We don't have mortgages. So what it really is a home loan payment. And more specifically than that, when you are making a monthly payment on a house when you own it, it's probably going to be a PITI payment. As you can see right here on my screen, PITI stands for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Now, this is not a guarantee. This is the structure of your monthly payment if you have what's called a budget loan. A budget loan is a loan that is designed to pay the bank back what you borrowed, and it's where you give the bank more money than that even, and they hold it for you to pay the taxes and insurance on behalf of you. So let me try to talk you through this, folks. Let's say that you had a monthly payment of $2,000. Okay, that was your monthly. I'm gonna say it, but I'm gonna give you air quotes. Monthly mortgage payment, and part of that is going to get bracketed into the P&I, and part of it's going to get bracketed into the T&I. And so principal and interest goes towards paying the bank back what you borrowed plus interest. That's how the banks make their money. Interest on the money you borrowed. So let's say that it was going to break down on payment one, folks. Payment one is going to be $2,000. But of that $2,000 that you paid, let's just say that $1,400 is going to go here and $600 is going to go here, which this is going to happen every single time you make this payment. Now, first understand something here, folks. This right here, the principal and interest, we call this in real estate land debt service. It's the debt that you have to pay the bank back for the money you borrowed plus interest. We call it debt service. So anytime you hear the word debt service, it's just the principal and interest payment. And if you had what was called a fully amortized fixed rate loan, I'm going to get into that in more depth in a minute. A fully amortized fixed rate loan, which is what most people have, this principal and interest payment will never change for the life of the loan. So I want you to think about this. How long is the average mortgage for?
30 years.
30 years. How many months is that? 360. There you go. So let me explain what happens here, folks. When you pay $2,000, and let's just say it's your very first payment, $1,400 is going to go to the bank for principal and interest, and $600 of that $2,000 in this example is going to go towards your taxes and insurance. Now, when I'm talking about a fully amortized fixed rate loan and debt service, payment 2 going to be $1,400, payment 3 $1,400, payment 360 is still going to be $1,400. If we are dealing with a fully amortized fixed rate loan, that amount that gets applied towards your principal and interest will not change. The way it gets allocated to the principal balance and the interest does change. And I'll explain that more in a second. Well, folks, only this side will not change. Why? Why does this side change? Taxes change. There you go. And insurance changes. Insurance just went up across the board in North Carolina and many other states. Taxes just went up across the board in a lot of counties in North Carolina. Folks, at minimum, tax values have to be reassessed in North Carolina. How often? At minimum. There you go, Tara. 8 years. We have that mandatory octennial reappraisal. At minimum, every county has to reassess your tax value every 8 years. How often could they actually do it, though? At minimum, it's 8, but how frequently could they do it if they wanted to? 4 years. Remember, there is the horizontal reassessment available every 4 years. Excuse me. Don't get confused, because there is something that's 1 year. What can change every year? Not the ad valorem, because that goes back to the assessed value. It's not the ad valorem. You wouldn't say that. Tax rate. There you go, Bridge. Tax rate. Folks, you got to be very careful with differentiating this on the test. The rate that they charge you on your value can and typically does change every single year. But they have to reassess your tax values every 8 years in North Carolina, and they can reassess your values every 4 years. Remember, we called that horizontal reassessment, means across the board. They can't just do one house, one neighborhood, or one city. It has to be the whole county. Across the board, they could raise it every 4 years. But be careful, because tax rate and tax values are different. What you got, Parker?
Are ad valorem taxes not assessed every year?
So you have to pay the taxes every year, but ad valorem is basically the fancy word for assessed value tax. So it's based off of that assessed value that doesn't change, but every 4 or 8 years. So the rate can change, but the assessed value doesn't. It's the same tax. You're paying the tax every year. But so, like, think about it this way, Parker. If my house was assessed at, $480,000 by the tax assessor, the rate that they charge me on that $480,000 could change every year. But at minimum, it would have to be based on that value for at least the next 4 years. And it potentially could be based on that value for the next 8 years. It is ad valorem tax, but it's the value of the property that's being taxed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So ad valorem is your real property taxes. Technically, your car, your personal property taxes are also referred to as ad valorem. Like I said, it's just really loosely translates to assessed value tax. And so you pay taxes on your car based on what the assessor thinks your car is worth, right? When you buy a brand new car, your registration and taxes are going to be way higher than when you have a used car, because they drop down because of depreciation and stuff. So same tax, but the value is only reassessed at minimum every 8 years and at maximum every 4 years. So because your taxes and insurance can and most likely will change, this amount does differentiate. So if you've ever like owned a home and you get a notice from your tax or from your mortgage company, I keep using the term because that's what's familiar, and they say something along the lines of, hey, you know, you were paying this much a month, but there wasn't enough in your escrows. There you go, Bill. It's an escrow adjustment. So they're going to say, okay, we're raising it from $2,000 to $2,200 because you had a deficiency in your escrows. So your payment can change, but it has nothing to do with your principal and interest. And most of the time, it's this side. So let me try to continue explaining this. What happens when you buy a house is they will actually ask you for money at closing. They say, give us some of your money to open an escrow account. Now, we talked about an escrow or trust account, as we called it, in the contract section. It's where somebody else is holding your money, or somebody is holding somebody else's money, should we say. So you are giving money to the bank to hold. And so what they'll say when you close on it, they're going to say, give us $1,000 at closing to open this account for you. And then when you make payment number one, $600 gets added into that. So it started at $1,000, add $600. You make payment number two, $600 gets added into that, add $600. You make payment number three, $600 gets added into that. And the whole purpose of this is when your real property tax bill and your insurance bill are due next year, you should have enough money in that account where they can say, okay, well, we're going to pay your $1,000 homeowner's insurance, I wish, and your $3,000 property taxes, I wish. And then they're going to leave $1,000 and they wash, rinse, repeat. Every single month, you will keep adding into it. They will pay your bills. And that's how it goes. So this is what most people do. And I told you this is called a budget loan. Is it required to have a pity payment? No. So you could, under certain loan types, pay your taxes and insurance out of pocket. But a lot of people don't like to do that because it's typically towards the end of the year. And so imagine right here, right now in November, getting slapped with $6,000 between real property taxes and insurance that you didn't necessarily budget for. So that's called a budget loan when you combine them together. Everybody still with me? So let's focus on the other side now that you kind of understand. And we're going to get into this a lot more, but this is just a basic understanding. So let me kind of just focus on the principal and interest side now for a minute. This is going to be what we call amortization math, because you take your debt service and you're making the exact same payment each month. Now, I told you the amount that you're paying in a fully amortized fixed rate loan is not going to change, but what does change is how it gets allocated. And here's what I mean. If you borrowed $200,000 from the bank, you have promised to pay them back their $200,000 plus interest. Well, let's say that you were doing 7% interest rate. When you're calculating interest, folks, what we call simple interest, that is an annual interest rate. Okay, that 7% is an annual interest rate. So let me show you how this works if we're calculating our interest. And this is, once you understand this is how credit cards work. Although they do end up being compounded if you don't pay off the balance, but that's not part of this class. if you take your $200,000 principal balance and multiply it by 7%, that is $14,000 in annual interest based on that principal balance. But folks, are you making an annual payment when you own a home? No, you're making a what?
Make a monthly.
A monthly payment. Bree says, what was the nickname for pre-night? There you go. What's that? Debt service. There you go. So because you're making a monthly payment, you take this annual interest and you divide it by the number of months in the year. So that is how much is going towards interest on payment number one. So what happens is you make the same principal and interest payment each month, and the banks take their interest first. And anything that's left over gets applied to your principal balance. So let me show you what this looks like. You make payment number one, $1,400 towards principal and interest. So of that $1,400 that you paid, $1,166.67 gets applied towards your interest first. So what is left after you make that $1,400 payment and you take out the interest, the $1,166.67, that is what's left to go towards your principal balance. So I told you we're taking this out of the equation right now. Your initial balance is $200,000. After payment number one, your balance will go down by $233.33. This is called amortization, the paying back of the loan. So after, let me kind of squeeze this in here, $200,000 minus the amount that gets applied towards principal, $233.33. Screw that up. Your new balance after payment one would be $199,766.67. Everybody with me? Sergio says, so robbery because the principal doesn't lower enough to change the interest payments. It does, but it's very insignificant. Now, folks, watch this. The way that a fully amortized, and let me just erase this since I got my calculator here blocking it anyway. The way that a fully amortized fixed rate loan works is your principal and interest payment is supposed to be the exact amount that when you make payment 360, your balance has been reduced to zero. That's the fully amortized piece of this. You've paid it off. So watch what happens. When you go to make payment number two, folks, how much are you paying in principal and interest on payment number two in this example? There you go, $1,400 still. Every single month in a fully amortized fixed rate loan, that number doesn't change. So when you make payment number two's $1,400 payment, it gets allocated slightly differently because now you would take your new balance and multiply it by your 7% interest divided by 12. And you see it went down ever so slightly, about $2. And so every single month, the amount that gets allocated towards interest goes down slightly, and the amount that gets applied towards principal goes up slightly, until eventually over time, they'll get a bit closer to even, and then it'll start to shift when you're a little over halfway through the loan, 17, 18 years, and then more will start getting kind of applied towards the principal until eventually you're paying next to no interest on the last few payments. But it does start out exceptionally interest heavy in the beginning. And so if we just did the same thing over again, right? Of the $1,400 that was paid for payment two, minus the amount that's going towards interest on payment two, $1,165.31. What's left to go towards principal on payment two? $1,400 minus $1,165.31 would be $234.69. So now you would subtract that out of your balance, $234.69. After making payment two, $199,766.67 minus 234.69. After payment 2, your new balance would be $199,531.98. Now, folks, if these numbers were correctly done, and I just pulled some numbers out of thin air, but if these were correctly done, what happens would be if I did this math 360 times, your balance is going to be reduced to 0. Yet again, that is the fully amortized piece. It's paying it off completely. So after 30 years, your balance would be 0. Your house would be paid off if you only make the minimum required monthly principal and interest payment. That's how this works. Now, as I said, I'm going to give you some more examples of this in a moment because I know this is a kind of an interesting concept to say the least, but most people are making monthly payments and it is a pity payment. Part of it is going towards your principal and interest. We call that debt service. And then the other part is going towards your escrows, your taxes and insurance. And really, the bank likes budget loans like this because they think that you're too stupid to pay your taxes and insurance on time. Folks, why would the bank care? There you go, Bill. Tax liens, highest priority lien. The bank does not want to be second in line to get their money. So you can get tax liens. Furthermore, if you don't have insurance and the house burns down, they have nothing to come after anymore. So they need you to have insurance and they need your taxes to be paid so that they can protect the property. The property, folks, is collateral to the bank, right? The property is collateral. They need that property to ensure that they get paid some way, shape, or form. So as I said, the principal and interest is referred to as debt service. And then, of course, the taxes and insurance are not part of your debt service in any way, shape, or form. They are, money is going to the bank. That's your money being held in escrow. They will be used to pay your tax bill and your insurance bill on the property that you own. What you got, Janet?
So, I have a question. So, how would I know if I have an escrow account if I don't remember if they talked about it with me when they
You just look at your monthly statement.
Their what?
Just look at your monthly statement. It'll be right there on there. It'll say how much went into your escrow account, if anything was paid out of your escrow account, and all that fun-filled jazz. So it'll say like your current balance, how much went to principal, how much went to interest, how much went into your escrow account. It's on your monthly statement.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And odds are good that that's what you did. It's very rare to do the other.
Okay, and is that something that we need to talk to our client with?
As a real estate agent?
Yeah.
Yeah, because here's the thing, and truth to be told, you're learning this right now. Most of you are going to forget this by the time you get your license. And so that one of the biggest thing that freaks out buyers when they buy the house, if nobody explains this to them, is they buy the house and then every single year they still get a tax bill in the mail. It'll say, hey, you owe us $5,000 in real property taxes, and people freak out. And they always call their agents, oh my God, do I owe $5,000? There you go. That's exactly right, Brad, especially first-time buyers. They're always freaking out, and we need to know this so we can be like, no. You've got a budget loan. Yours is escrowed. Your escrow accounts are going to pay that. It's just you need to know that that's how much is coming out of your escrow account. And, of course, that there may or may not be adjustments. But, yeah, that's a big thing in our industry. A lot of people don't realize it. Now, here's kind of a visual representation, as I told you, of how the interest and the principal balance kind of have this crazy correlation over time. And so you were dealing with, mostly interest paid in the beginning. And then, of course, as time goes on, your principal jumps up, to kind of combat how much interest is being paid overall. But in this example, I mean, this is accurate numbers, $200,000 mortgage amortized at 30 years at 5.5% interest. You've actually spent more than what you borrowed in interest. The total cost of this loan being about $408,000 for the $200,000 you borrowed. Now, as I start to teach this, a lot of you will probably sit here and think that mortgages are highway robbery, but the thing that you have to understand is rent is 1,000% going into somebody else's pocket in every way, shape, or form. At the end of the day, if you paid off this house, it's probably worth, depending on what you bought it for, your down payment, at least $400,000. So even though you spent $408,000, you still could sell it and get $400,000. And that's $400,000 in equity, $400,000 in cash that you could use versus spending $400,000 the next 30 years on rent. You got nothing. No, you got out of maintenance. But there's also tax advantages as well to owning real estate. So let's introduce some vocab here while we're talking about these things, folks. I just used this word equity. Equity is the difference between what you could sell your property for and what you owe the bank. That's equity. So if you own a house that you could sell for $400,000, as I just kind of used in that previous example, and you owe the bank $200,000 currently, you have $200,000 in equity. If you pay off your loan to zero and you could sell it for $400,000, you've got $400,000 in equity. Folks, this is what happens whenever you hear somebody talking about like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos and their net worth. They don't have $6.7 billion in the bank. Net worth includes their equity in real estate. What they're basically saying in a net worth is if you sold everything they own at current value today and paid off all their debts today, what they'd be left with. That is somebody's net worth. And so equity is included in that. Doesn't mean they have that intangible assets or cash. Or something with liquidity. Equity is included. Now you do need to know the 3 ways that you can increase your equity on a property. Okay, number 1, you need to know what equity is, the difference between what you could sell for and what you owe the bank. But the 3 ways that you increase equity, of course, paying down your debt service. If you pay down your loan balance or pay it off, your equity goes up. Capital improvements, doing improvements to the property to make them more valuable would be a way to increase equity. And then, of course, the last one is appreciation. The market going up and the value of your property going up simultaneously. If you buy a house for $300,000 and 10 years later you could sell it for $500,000, that's appreciation. So all 3 of these increase your equity in your real estate. Now this other word, usury. Usury is the practice of charging higher interest rates than limits set by law. And there are limits set by law for interest rates, and it depends on the type of interest. If it's a credit card, it's different than it is for a home, different than it is for, personal loan. But there are limits set. The usury laws sets the limits. That's all usury is. Charging more than the interest rate limit set by law. And usury laws are the ones that set the limits. So if you see that word, that's what that means. Now let me introduce the first math concept in this section. Let's go ahead and rip this Band-Aid. And this is one that students have a tendency to not love. And so it is what we call discount points. Discount points. Discount points, folks, it's prepaid interest. It is interest that you would pay the lender right off the bat. Why? Because if you pay them a fat chunk of interest at the beginning of the loan, they will reduce the interest rate over the life of the loan. So this increases the yield to the lender initially and lowers the interest rate to the consumer. Now, this is not always a good idea. And the other thing that I'm going to point out to you is that it's very expensive. 1 discount point costs you 1% of the loan amount. So in other words, if you borrowed $300,000 and you were to purchase 1 discount point, folks, you're looking at $3,000, right? $300,000 times 1%, $3,000. That's a big old chunk of change. Especially when you consider, now this is the hard part that people have trouble with, that purchasing a discount point only reduces your interest rate by 1/8 of a percent. 1/8 of a percent. In other words, folks, remember what I told you to think about fractions. Fractions are their own equation. If you say 1 divided by 8, what we're really looking at is 0.125. So if we were dealing with a 1 discount point in this scenario, it's going to cost you $3,000. And if you were getting a 7% interest rate before buying it, after buying it, it would be a 7 minus 0.125. Or in other words, you have only reduced it to a 6.875% interest rate. It's not a whole big chunk of change. Just to put it in perspective, if you wanted to move from a 7 to a 6, now there are caps on this, you would have to buy 8 points, which would be $300,000 times 8%. $24,000 is how much you would have to, in this fictitious scenario that I'm giving you, how much money you would have to give the banks up front at closing to buy your interest rate from a 7 to a 6. And here's the crazy thing, folks. I want you to think about it. Here's why these are not always a good idea. Even moving from a 7 to a 6 may change your monthly payment by at most $200 to $300, if we're being completely honest. And I want you to think about this. $24,000 divided by $300, it would take you 80 months to make that money back. Divided by 12, that is 6.67 years to make that money back. So if you were to buy down your interest rate that much, and you were to sell or refinance in less than 6.7 years, you just pissed away money for no reason. Yay, discount points. But I'm telling you, the reason why people get really confused on this from a real estate class point of view is it costs the consumer 1% of the loan amount. By the way, go ahead and burn this in your brains. If we're dealing with any kind of loan cost, you always have to charge it off the loan amount. We cannot charge you loan cost off of purchase price. You can only get charged interest or discount on money you borrowed. If you didn't borrow it, they can't charge you on it. So 1% of the loan amount is how much a discount point costs. But purchasing 1 discount point only reduces your interest rate by 1/8 of a percent. You would have to buy 2 points to move it 0.25 of a percent, 4 points to move it 1/2 of a percent, 6 points to move it 3/4 of a percent, and 8 points to move it 1%. Think of it like a slice or like a pizza pie, right? You got to buy the whole pizza to move it 1% down. But it still costs 1% of the loan amount to buy each discount point. So just as another example here, $200,000 loan, discount point would cost you $2,000. And so in this example, the interest rate at 5%, buying that one, or you'd have to buy 2 discount points is what it's saying for a total of $4,000. Now let me tell you how this could manifest on the test. It would say something like, a buyer is borrowing $200,000 and is purchasing 2 discount points. How would that show up on the closing disclosure? And you would say a $4,000 buyer debit because it is a buyer cost, right? It's part of the loan cost. So you'd have to calculate it. 2 points would be 2% of $200,000 or $4,000. The other thing that you could potentially see is somebody bought 4 points. Their interest rate was this. What's their new interest rate? Word of caution, though. We are going to get into a more in-depth concept later on the full closing disclosure. What all the costs on a closing disclosure could be. They are sometimes going to have discount points on there, but don't ever change the interest rate on a closing disclosure problem. The presumption is that the interest rate has already been adjusted for the discount points they're charging you. Some people get a little overzealous thinking that we're trying to trick you there. We're not. So on a closing disclosure problem, if it says, interest rate of 6%, getting 6 discount points, that's already reduced with the discount points. So you would not have to double dip there. You just leave the interest rate at 6%. And I'll show you a practice one later when we get to that section. So let me introduce another math concept, if you will. And it's both a math concept and you got to understand this concept. What we call loan to value ratios. And so let me just give you an example. One of the most common conventional loans is what we call an 80% LTV. 80% LTV, loan to value ratio. And so what that means is the percentage of the purchase price or appraised value that you are borrowing. So if I said an 80% LTV, that means you are borrowing 80% of the purchase price. And so if we're dealing with a home that cost $400,000, so we'll say purchase price, your loan amount is 80% of that purchase price. Yet again, just like a lot of other math in our class, it's percentages. 400,000 times 80% would be a loan amount of $300,000. Why is this important? Because I told you loan costs can only be charged on loan amount. So if I told you that a home was being purchased for $400,000, they got an 80% loan to value ratio, and they were purchasing 3 discount points, you would have to find this number first and then multiply it by 3% to tell me how many discount points or how much the discount points are actually costing. It's what we call multi-step math problems. You can't do it off of purchase price. You got to find the loan amount first. Now, let me go ahead and, just while we're at this, let me go ahead and explain the other side of this. I told you that your loan to value ratio is the percentage that you're borrowing based on your purchase price or appraised value, whichever is lower. So in this scenario, imagine that it appraised just fine. This is what it would look like. But if I was to throw a wrench in this and I said, okay, well, you wanted to buy it for $400,000 still. But when an appraiser went out there, I'll call that AV, appraised value, an appraiser goes out there and tells you that they think it's only worth $380,000. If you're doing an 80% loan to value ratio, they're not going to give you 80% of $400,000. If it doesn't appraise, they will give you 80% of the appraised value. So see the difference here. $380,000 appraised value times your 80% means now the banks are only going to lend you $304,000. Can you still buy the house? Sure. But now you're bringing a $96,000 down payment versus an $80,000 down payment. Unless you could potentially renegotiate with the seller to adjust something, but the seller has no obligation to do that. What you got, Brooks?
As prospective real estate agents, how would a real estate agent go about trying to bridge the gap? Or is there a way that Wiz real estate agents push them towards a more favorable lender? Or is there a way to increase the home appraisal value without increasing the equity for the current owners?
So the short answer is that's too complex for this class. But yes, there are things we can do. So number one, we want to be educated and educate our clients if we think that there's going to be any discrepancies, right? So we would look at it and say, okay, well, hey, there's a chance that, even if we offer them this, it's not going to appraise. So we would use our knowledge to kind of advise them on that. And then we would typically have a conversation with the other side, like, well, hey, what are you willing to do if it doesn't appraise? Would you be willing to meet in the middle? Would you expect us to come up with all of it? Just so we can kind of come to terms on it. Now, in extreme circumstances, if we think the appraiser did a bad job, we can push it back to the lender and have them order a review appraisal. And then, of course, sometimes very, very risky, but sometimes worth the rewards scenario in the real world is they will switch lenders. And if they switch lenders in the middle of the transaction, that will require a new appraisal. But we're rolling the dice, hoping this other appraisal comes back higher. So there are things we can do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes this kills deals. It can be really bad. Yeah. So loan to value ratio, we're going to talk about this several different times throughout the class. And so let me, now that I've kind of explained the loan to value ratio, show you yet again how this comes into play. We've already talked about discount points, and that would be calculated based on your loan amount. But there is also something called origination fees. So between the two, the math would be the same. So in this example, if I said somebody's purchasing one discount point, purchase price of $265, 80% loan to value ratio, multi-step math problem, right? You've got to find the loan amount first and then multiply it by the 2 discount points they're purchasing to find their discount point buyer debit. And I will tell you, though, that while discount points are a standardized 1%, sometimes the question will say they're purchasing 2.5 points. Don't overthink it. They would just be times 2.5%, right? 3.5 points, 3.5%. And then the other one that I just mentioned, which is the origination fee, also percentages. There is no one size fits all for origination fee, though. It could be 1%, it could be 2%, it could be 3%. Just do the math. It'll say the bank's charging you a 6% origination fee, a 1% origination fee. One word of caution, though, we use the exact same numbers here. Sometimes, folks, they will say a 0.5% origination fee. Do not put that in as just 0.5 because 0.5% is 0.005. You got to make sure you understand that from a calculating point of view. Because if we were looking at a 0.5% origination fee of the $212,000, remember, if you're not comfortable, have the calculator do it times 0.5%. Going to be 1060. It's just percentages. Loan origination fee, they will always tell you it's 1%, it's 2%, it's 3%, whatever. And then discount points are always 1% of the loan amount, but they could say they're buying 2.5 discount points. They will throw you that curveball. So let me ask you a question. True or false? Discount points are prepaid interest that increase the lender's yield and decrease the interest rate for the borrower. There you go. True. Of course, it increases the lender's yield. You're giving them a fat stack of cash up front that they normally would have had to wait 3, 4, 5, 6 years to get, and you just handed it right over. And I told you, a lot of instances, discount points are not a wise decision, especially if you think interest rates are going to come down. You'd have the ability to refinance if you're not going to live there for a very long period of time. But imagine that you stayed in the house for 30 years and you never refinanced, then you would have saved a lot of money because you made it back at year 18. Which means year 8, which everything after that, or what was it, 6 actually, in that example I gave. Everything after year 6 would be saving money. But there's a time and a place. Sometimes they're not a good idea. How about this one? I'll be quiet, you read it and answer it, and then we'll talk about it. There you go. Getting a lot of similar answers there. If you're still working on it, that's fine. Bernard Byers borrowing $180,000 on the sales price of $225,000 for his new condo at North Hills. He wishes to pay 2 discount points of prepaid interest on the loan. How much will he be debited at closing? And of course, we already gave you the loan amount. You didn't have to do the loan value math here, but you did need to make sure you grab the right number. 180,000 times your 2% would give you your $3,600 buyer debit. Loan costs. Also, be very careful on the test, folks. Anytime we're dealing with loan costs, with the exception of loan payoff, loan costs are always a buyer thing, right? If it's interim interest, if it's discount points, if it's origination fees, all these loan costs are buyer debits except for the loan payoff. Now, folks, I'm about to introduce one more math concept, and I'm going to warn you here. You are going to look at this one, and you are going to hate it. And it's going to seem like this is the hardest math concept that I will probably teach you, but you'll realize it's actually not that bad if you just look at it with me for a minute. But it is going to look like you hate it for a period of time, I promise. That's just how you're going to read it, and you're going to be like, I don't like this. So I'm going to pull up a chart here. I'm going to have the chart sitting at the ready, and I'm going to kind of show you what we're dealing with. Let's see if it's right here.